Goodbye. Welcome to Speak Sex. I'm your host, Eurydice, and our guest today is Chris Hedges. Welcome to the show, Chris.
Thank you.
Chris is a journalist, a minister, an author, and a television host with RT TV. He has spent 2 decades, more or less, as a correspondent in Central America, the Middle East, Africa, and the Balkans. He wrote for the New York Times for 15 years. He's the author of more than a dozen books, best-selling books, including America, the Farewell Tour, great book. War is the Force That Gives Us Meaning, another book I love, which I think is apt right now. Empire of Illusion, Death of the Liberal Class, Days of Destruction, Days of Revolt. So, Chris, you have covered war up close in the Balkans, and you've written about, watching your friends, your colleagues, and just the population, become intoxicated by war, even addicted to war, to that experience of war, and become, let's say, be taken advantage by the nationalist machine to kind of enter the rites of war, which are the ancient rites of manhood and adulthood, right? And sacrifice lives and hopes and dreams to this madness, this kind of collective madness. And here we are. I mean, who would have thought? It's 2021. We're just coming out of the pandemic. There is a generation, a younger generation, who probably imagined we're post-war. The entire globalism advertisement, right, was that we're going to have global peace because of corporate control, because war's bad for business, was the promise, right? And it's pretty extraordinary to hear the voices of the past, pulling us back, and especially that drumming of war. We can all feel it, it's almost like the call, the call of war is coming closer and closer. So I was originally going to talk to you about Eros and Thanatos, right? About how war reenacts sex and the domination, the instinct to dominate and the instinct to mate. And but I think this is just the moment, where we need your voice, and it's we're meant to be talking on the day where it looks that war has become official. So give us a little bit of your take on what's happening at this moment in the world and in America.
Well, as Randolph Bourne said, war is the health of the state. So every state, especially when it suffers from economic stagnation or political dysfunction, will reach for war as an antidote. I mean, in War is the Force That Gives Us Meaning, I write about being in Argentina in the weeks before the Falkland War, the war with Las Malvinas, if you speak Spanish. And the junta was barely clinging to power. There were giant street demonstrations. I was in them. It's the first time I was tear gassed, probably CS gassed. I was blinded. And then they invade the islands, and they literally were pulling labor leaders who had led a lot of the demonstrations out of jail to go on television, and their faces were still scarred in black and blue, and they were saying Las Malvinas son Argentinas. And it was a very instructive moment for me. I was very young, because it showed me that toxic quality that nationalism has, and reminded me of Kafka's Metamorphosis, where anybody who spoke with any sanity might as well have been a large cockroach. Just to even question the virility of the Argentine military and the junta, who went literally overnight from being detested to being lionized, was to court violence. And so I learned at a very young age what nationalism does, how seductive it is, and how it is used by those who perpetuate war to entice, especially young men or young people, into conflict. War itself, and I covered a lot of wars, Central America, the Middle East, war in the former Yugoslavia, isn't anything like it. It's sold to us as. So once you get into combat, the experience exposes the lie, but by then it's too late. So yeah, we are once again seeing the kind of rhetoric, the demonization of Putin without any. I was in Eastern Europe in 1989 and covered the revolutions. There was a general consensus among every diplomat or a political figure that I spoke to that if you extended NATO beyond the borders of a unified Germany, which Reagan had promised Gorbachev would not be done, you would be antagonizing Moscow and fueling an eventual conflict, which unfortunately has now come to pass. I mean, people forget that there is a missile base in Poland that is 100 miles, a NATO missile base that is 100 miles from the Russian border. I mean, would we tolerate this in the United States? I mean, in the Cuban Missile Crisis, Cuba's 90 miles from the coast of Florida. So, and the lack of historical perspective, the failure to look at this conflict from the other side. There are no innocents in war, but the Russians have, I think, I'm not justifying, they haven't, by the way, sent any troops into the Donbass, but yet. The cant of nationalism, and the flip side of nationalism is always about self-exaltation. It's always about elevating ourselves. I mean, I was listening to NPR, CNN or something, and they were talking about how Putin doesn't share our values. He doesn't care about democracy. And I'm thinking, we just spent 20 years savaging the Middle East in preemptive war, which under post-Nuremberg laws is considered a criminal act of aggression. It's a war crime. So the lack of perspective is typical of that intoxication of nationalism, which destroys any kind of rational debate. It's emotionally driven. It's not rationally driven. And of course, that unfortunately is coloring what's happening to us today. Yeah, it's definitely a very unreasonable moment. And it looks, I mean, when you agree with Thomas Friedman in the New York Times, that's when it looks like we somewhat purposefully, and definitely arrogantly and thoughtlessly, but somewhat purposefully maybe, did not bring Russia into, NATO or an equivalent kind of like strategic alliance. Well, kept it like as an outsider, right, as the bad guy. Right, but the whole case we needed it. The whole raison d'etre for NATO was to stop Soviet expansion. So it's 1989. The Soviet Union collapses, and NATO expands. Yeah, NATO should. It just doesn't make any sense. Itself. And most people understood that the Russians, especially under Gorbachev, were quite open to a joint security arrangement. This is the tragedy. But the reason that it expanded was not for national security. No, no U.S. troops are going to be sent to die over the Ukraine, fight over the Ukraine. It was because of these billions of dollars that the arms manufacturers would be able to make if Poland, the Czech Republic, Romania, everybody could join NATO. They'd have to convert their Eastern European bloc Soviet-compatible weapon systems, which are different caliber. A lot of people don't know. Especially on the heavy weapons, to NATO equipment, which is, I mean, I was in Poland a couple of years ago, and there are billboards from Raytheon all over the place because, of course, Raytheon is fleecing the Polish people, probably with IMF loans, so they can refit their military. It doesn't make any sense unless you're an arms manufacturer. And that's unfortunately what drove the policy. And it's also the reason we stayed in Afghanistan long after everyone knew, and we know from the Afghan papers that were published in the Washington Post that this was true. They all knew the conflict was a quagmire, that there was no chance that we were going to, under a corrupt regime in Kabul, going to dominate the country or control the Taliban. But of course, there were companies making money hand over fist, and that, unfortunately, that war industry drives so much of our foreign policy, and they need a conflict. And if it's not with Russia, then it'll be with China. I mean, they need a conflict in order to justify these massive Pentagon budgets, which are used for arms expenditures, most of which we don't need.
Yeah. And how do people, I guess, I mean, the only thing to do is speak this truth again and again, but it's very hard for the average citizen, who has their lives and who just read headlines, to not fall for the mainstream, for the mainstream propaganda, because, and yes, you're right, it's not just the military industrial complex, let's say, that profits from these weapons being used, bought, sold, but also the media. War is great for ratings. I mean, from the Iraq war on, being able to watch war live turned out to be very profitable entertainment. And it's good distraction for leaders like Biden or Johnson or Putin or whoever, who otherwise are failing their people. And it seems like when the whole system is against the average citizen, how does the average person resist all this and stand up and say no to war?
Well, part of the problem is that there isn't a real discussion about these kinds of conflicts. The corporate media and some of these corporate entities, General Electric, are fused with the war industry itself. They perpetuate this kind of groupthink by making sure that all their analysts come from the military or the defense industry or the intelligence community, and voices like mine. I mean, I experienced this on the inception of the invasion of Iraq. So I've been the Middle East bureau chief for the New York Times. I spent 7 years in the Middle East. I speak Arabic. I understood, like most Arabists, that invading Iraq was arguably the worst strategic decision in American history, given what unfolded in the Middle East. But my voice was shut out because I didn't chant with the mainstream. And these quote unquote experts on Iraq or the Middle East had not a fraction of the experience that I had in the Middle East. But they parroted the dominant narrative. And so they were given a platform and their voice was amplified while mine was silenced virtually.
Yeah, that's exactly what happens. Yeah, the same thing happened. I mean, for me as a Greek, it was a tremendous shock when suddenly my America, the nation of my heart, was bombing a neighbor nation. When Sarajevo, Belgrade. I mean, they're like a minute away geographically speaking. It's Europe, and the idea that Europe was doing that America was bombing European cities, right? And then the fracturing of that country and the kind of artificial borders, the forcing enemies, in traditional enemies, to co-govern and co-rule, and setting up countries like Kosovo, which interestingly, Putin referred to because it's not been recognized by the UN yet. So, he mentioned American aggression, right, to compare it to Russian aggression, because we are certainly not the doves that we appear to be. Marx said that, I read you quote Marx, saying that war disconnects the working class in one country from another, so that and that's, I guess, Rosa Luxemburg. But nationalism is a tool to isolate the people, right? To isolate the working class and betray it, because this kind of like a dualism of like, you're either with us or you're against us, right? You're either a patriot or a traitor. Confuses this hyper-nationalism confuses the working class about what our own interests are, and it feels like here we are, we're in a moment of like coming out of the pandemic, inflation, the Great Resignation, and how do you kind of like shake everybody back into obedience, to the fatherland. And war makes the stakes really high, right? When people are dying.
This is what Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht and others understood at the inception of the First World War. The socialists, unfortunately, believed that they could, up until the war began, that they could organize the working class to boycott the war, to refuse to fight each other. And there was a strong socialist component in France and strong anti-war movement in France as well. But they underestimated the power of nationalism. And so, of course, Luxemburg and Liebknecht, who most of the socialists in the Reichstag sell out and vote for the war credits to support the war under the Kaiser. Leipzig and Luxemburg refuse and are imprisoned. And then at the end of the war, when people realize that they've been betrayed, and that is what war is always about. It's about betrayal of the young by the old, betrayal of soldiers by politicians, betrayal of idealists by cynics. That's what war is about. And then, of course, they're assassinated when they rise up against the nascent Nazi movement in the form of the Freikorps and everything else. So, yes, that nationalism has a powerful pull, because nationalism is at its core. It does two things. I mean, I write about this in War as a Force That Gives Us Meaning. It, one, elevates you above the other, because the flip side of nationalism is always racism. You see it the way they speak about Putin. But that's true in every conflict. And the other thing it does is that it appears to obliterate the alienation that you feel in a modern society. So suddenly you all feel like you're comrades. Comradeship, and I write quite a bit about this, is not friendship. It's mistaken for friendship, because comradeship is about conformity. If you don't conform to the crowd, you're not a comrade. But you suddenly appear as a unit. And one of the things you'll find with soldiers and Marines after a conflict is that what they miss, and even to an extent I miss it among war correspondents, is that comradeship. And they seek, soldiers will seek after a conflict to recreate it, usually by getting together and drinking. But it's just sad and pathetic, because it doesn't exist without an existential threat, a real existential threat. That's what creates this tribal sense of unity in a conflict. But I've been victim of it. I've felt it. And it is very powerful and very seductive. But it is really at its core the opposite of friendship, because in comradeship is about sacrifice, self-sacrifice. It's about death. It's about in many ways worshiping death. Mm-hmm. Whereas if you have somebody who is a friend, you fear for their safety. You don't want them to die. Mm-hmm. But in that moment, it is a band of brothers. It's mistaken for what it isn't. And so these forces of nationalism, these forces of comradeship, are very, very overpowering.
Yeah, that's what your title says. War is the force that gives us meaning, right? And like, I think that what you're saying in its cleanest form is that nationalism, this kind of false consciousness, makes us actually believe what's at at worst for us, what's not in our self-interest. It makes us somehow believe that we're more valuable dead than alive, that we are that it would be more worthy for us to lose our life, to, sadden and hurt our loved ones, to take away from our mothers, their children, that would be more worthy than survival. I mean, that's kind of like the ultimate ability of culture to overcome nature, right? Because our natural instinct is to survive no matter what. And that's kind of the apotheosis of a cultural indoctrination when that's turned around on its head. But yeah, it tells me that we do not live in a rational world, as you said, despite what we've been told by, the digital, tech world, by Googlification. Now everything can be reduced to algorithms. Well, it seems that these old instincts are much more powerful than, our kind of corporate leaders were willing to admit. And I don't know how far this would go.
I would say the corporate leaders have very skillfully learned how to manipulate emotion. So what drives you into that embrace? It's fear. They make you afraid. And we're just constantly made afraid of something. The war on terror, or, whatever the latest iteration is, communism. So fear is a paralyzing force, and in essence, those who engage in active prosecutions of war, and you get to the last chapter of my book, which comes from Freud, of course, Eros and Thanatos being the death instinct. That is what war is about. It is about being embraced by the death instinct, which at its beginning, at its inception, looks and feels like love, the very force that war destroys. So in war, it's about the destruction of all systems that sustain life, not just other human beings, but all social institutions that nurture life. I mean, for instance, at the beginning of the war in Bosnia, the Serb gunners on the hill bombed the library and sent it up into one of the great libraries of Eastern Europe, sent it up in flames. But
same in Baghdad. The library,
Baghdad,
the oldest Quran. Yeah. And the archaeological museum just looted, plundered.
Right. So that's what war does. It environmental, cultural, social, religious, all systems that sustain life. Now, religious institutions often become or lend themselves to war and sacralize war. I would argue this is heretical, but it's often done. It was certainly done in the wars that I covered in the Middle East and in the former Yugoslavia. But it does get to that sharp line between Eros, that instinct to preserve, nurture, protect life, and Thanatos. And of course, what you do in war is you turn other human beings into objects. And this is why rape is so common in war. It's why when soldiers or troops talk about sex, it's always, they equate it with defecation.
Yeah.
Well, they talk about it as if it's a form of defecation. And
defecation?
It's the crude language that's used to describe sex is meant to strip it away of anything but its animalistic quality. So you are, turning women and girls into objects. You are turning the enemy into objects. That objectification of the other is a fundamental part of war, and it's why there's always so much sexual violence in war.
Yeah, there is so much sexual objectification, by ourselves as well as against those that we, turn into our enemy. And what happens to the children, and to, it's not just something that happens to one generation, it kind of seeps into everyone who witnesses it. So, the mothers, the children, the next generations, it's kind of like a well that gets poisoned. And a lot of these hatreds. When people lose their lives and it seems unfair, then it breeds, right, generations of hatred, and the conflict just kind of like self-generates.
Right. Well, you look at Ratko Mladic, who was the Bosnian Serb general. His father was killed when he was a young boy by Ustasha. These were the fascist forces out of Croatia, allied with the Nazis. But they had Muslim battalions. His father was killed by a Muslim battalion of Ustasha, executed. And decades later, he essentially is executing men and boys in Srebrenica. And I don't want to push the psychological element too far, but there's certainly an element of vengeance.
Oh yeah.
Kind of an attempt to carry out acts driven by the trauma that he experienced as a child. So yes, you never shake it. I mean, trauma is not static, it's dynamic. And of course, having covered war for 20 years, the way it manifests itself in my own life most palpably is at night. I mean, with nightmares, it's the wrong word for it, because it's really night terrors where you wake up and you're covered with sweat, and you sometimes you can't even remember what it was, but what you do feel is that awful fear that grips you at a moment when you think that you may be killed or you're in mortal danger. And nobody who's been to war can ever escape it. It carries it with you, and it has to color your own the way you relate to other people and deal with the world around you. So yes, you're right. There is a kind of ripple effect, a generational effect from war, and in that sense, that trauma is not contained in the moment.
Yeah. And, we have to remember that every action has a reaction, that we're all connected, that we're all, part of like the mass brain. Like Putin is doing this in response to what he perceives was done to him, and so it's chain, right? So I think it's just tragic that this new generation that, was born without understanding war, except perhaps in video games, may suddenly be exposed to the horror of it, because that means we've delayed whatever possibility of like evolution we had out of, patriarchy and the same kind of like rights of control and domination and thievery and colonizing and all that, into something a little more enlightened or meta.
But there is a segment of our population that has been to war. I mean, we have an all-volunteer army, but it falls primarily on those who are economically disadvantaged. I think 2 or 3 or 4% of the population, and they have been deeply traumatized by their experiences in Afghanistan and Iraq. They gravitate to these right-wing militias. They are hired by private contractors. They are hired to work as corrections officers in prisons. So that trauma is being expressed in very dark ways throughout the society. In the same way, let's go back to World War I. The Freikorps was used to essentially crush the left when it rose up. And we do see that element. These people, if you look at the storming of the Capitol, at one point they form a line, men form a line, and having watched soldiers breach buildings, it was chilling, because that they knew what they were doing. They knew how to breach a door.
They were trained warriors.
Right, they were trained,
Yeah. Well, again, the ideal of America, and I say that as a first-generation person, I came here when I was 15. When I was about 9, I think, I was in Athens. My dad had gone to Germany for business, and there was the uprising of the students against the junta in 1973, I think it was. But the point is, the TV didn't work, the phones didn't work. My mom, knowing nothing, said, go out and find out what's happening. And there are tanks and soldiers in the streets. And it was a life-changing experience. it made me want to look for the Communist Youth Party, because the communists had, been leading the uprising against the colonels. But really, in the end, I just wanted to get away. It was too much history. It was too many stories. It was so much, that it was so heavy, that burden of that inheritance. And I felt that by coming all the way to LA, the town of like movies and make believe, that I would enter a post-historical world. America had never been conquered. America was like this magical other possibility that was not like what we knew in Europe as like the land of our fathers and of all these like stories. It was like lightweight. But somehow, America with this kind of like potentiality, that doesn't meet its potential, which is like what the world hopes for it and wants from it, and instead gets itself right back into that, gross arena and creates trouble and profits from trouble, and just, to me, it's like everything that, America could have liberated us from, and instead it doesn't. It will not meet its promise, and it's heartbreaking, because that was our only option, really. It was like our way out.
Well, I would argue that the American myth is a lie. First of all, the people who founded the country were white supremacists. America was invaded, and it was invaded
but it was invaded by like the king,
people.
The king, and
so
it was theoretically
it was invaded by Euro-Americans who wiped out Native Americans. So it was invaded. They carried out an act of genocide that destroyed, probably annihilated about 90%.
But one could argue, if one wanted, that the kings of Spain and the kings of England and the kings of this, all these, already like poisonous, great and old powers were making this decision. One could give like some of the founders that benefit of the doubt. They were rebelling against their own rulers.
That it was an aristocratic elite that wanted control. But if you look at the life of Washington, for instance, he had fought in the Indian Wars. He'd actually fought with the British under Braddock, and he was ruthless. I mean, he executed deserters, he flogged his men, he destroyed Native American villages. He expelled the few blacks that were in the Revolutionary Army because he didn't want them to learn how to bear arms. He was terrible to his own. He and his wife had 300 slaves. There's a famous story of one of his wife's servants. She was 20, fleeing north. He just relentlessly pursued this young woman to try and get her back. If he found slaves he didn't like, he shipped them off to the sugar plantations in the Caribbean. He was very freely used the whip. And so Jefferson wasn't any different. In fact, Jefferson had 7 children with Sally Hemings, who was his slave, was an enslaved woman. And Martha Washington's, one of her servants was her sister, because as usual, the rape on the part of the white slaveholders was massive. And this, they had the same father, and she enslaved her. I mean, she treated her as a slave. So there's a darkness in the American past that is covered up in these high ideals.
That's the original sin of America, slavery
and genocide. And I mean, we created an apartheid state where if you were black or you were Native American or you were a woman or you were a man without property, you were a second-class citizen. So I think we often get caught up in the rhetoric without looking at the actual foundational beliefs that set the country in motion. You're right, Hollywood is a perfect myth-making machine, but that's what it is. It's a myth, and James Baldwin writes about this continuously, the failure on the part of white Americans to face who they were and where they came from, which, as Baldwin writes, sees them confuse ignorance with innocence, creates monsters. And I would argue that our inability to face where we came from, who we are, and what we've done sees us perpetuating the same kinds of atrocities. I mean, the history of the American empire, especially since the end of World War II, has been filled with violence and coups and overthrowing governments and assassinations.
Right, yeah.
And it's a very, very dark history, which we don't talk about, but which I think defines us as a nation. And until we grapple with that definition, we're doomed to repeat it. And of course, the problem is that ultimately becomes very self-destructive. And that is, Thucydides writes about it in the Peloponnesian War. He said the tyranny that Athens imposed on others, it finally imposed on itself.
Yes.
And that's what's happening.
Yes, yes. It's interesting that leaders like Trump and right-wing populists like Tucker Carlson now are, you know, in a way that seems almost confounding, are in agreement with what leaders of the left and, you know, let's say left-wing populists have been thinking, you know, and people like you have been discussing about this issue all along, about the issue of empire and war. And this seems to be perhaps the first time in recent years where the right wing, through its populist movement, is meeting the left, the left wing liberals in agreement against this imperial self-destructive instincts.
They meet on the analysis, not on the solution. I mean, my solution is socialism. So those are very different. We may agree on much of the structural problems. And it's interesting that, for instance, although I am a self-declared socialist, Ron Paul will post my critiques often on his website, who's a libertarian. I'm not a libertarian. So there is a convergence on the analysis of some of the problems, in the same way that there was a convergence on an analysis of problems in Weimar Germany between the socialists and the fascists. But that convergence then sees them become mortal enemies when they seek to construct a response.
You mean a political response?
Because I am a fierce anti-fascist.
Yeah. So you would audit the Pentagon and the Defense Department, and they wouldn't, or would they?
Not only audit. Well, it doesn't matter because the Pentagon has escaped being audited for over a decade. I mean, they're beyond control. I would slash the Pentagon budget. It's we spend more on the military than the next 9 countries, including Russia and China combined. And this, of course, is another symptom of late empire. It's how you destroy an open society. So I would slash the Pentagon budget by probably 3/4.
Yeah.
And that's not something the right wing wants. They deify the military and law enforcement.
Yeah. Well, having this idea of America as like the world order policeman, which made sense in 1945, I guess, but no longer makes sense, it's something that we all have to agree on, and move forward and say this is no longer the case. We no longer want this job. We don't have to have this job. There is nothing to police, and just, quit. This was a voluntary position, and we no longer have a need to go out in the world and tell other countries far-flung what to do and how to do it. And, our military should exist only for the basic purposes of the military organization, for self-defense.
But what did it mean to be the world's policeman? We overthrew the leftist government. We can start in Greece.
Yes.
And fomented a civil war. We overthrew Mossadegh in Iran.
Cyprus
we overthrew Cyprus. We overthrew Arbenz in Guatemala. We orchestrated the assassination of Patrice Lumumba, along with Che. The world's policeman meant making the world safe for American corporations,
right?
Under the name of being the world's bully. So even that self-appointed role was fictitious.
Yeah. Well, it seems that Russia does not want to be out-bullied, and that right now, with the rise of Russia and China because of globalization, and the promise of the global economy as the promoter of world peace, that certainly has backfired, and in fact it has empowered these two old empires that had been weakened after years of world wars and cold wars, has empowered them to want to be bullies at the level of America. And this is where we are right now. I think that the aggression has just begun in Ukraine as we speak, in the breakaway enclaves, with the Russian troops in there as peacekeepers. We don't know right now how overwhelming the aggression will be, and how far the Russians want to go. I am sure that there is a lot of nostalgia playing into it. It seems like a very emotional issue for Putin and his cadre of aging leaders. The idea of reuniting the lost glory, something that all countries, including my own, Greece, suffer from, right? This kind of like adoration of what was, of the past, rather than of what it should be, which is the future. Kind of like bemoaning the breakup of the empire, which is a very familiar note in the history of patriarchy for the past, 6,000 years. So all this, this set of grievances and disappointments that, aging men in particular, nourish aging people, regrets, all of that seems to play into Putin's decision to, not just ratchet up tension, but to actually invade. And I do want to say that, we were threatening sanctions, but the only sanction that would make sense for Putin would be stopping the sale of gas to Europe, and that's not going to happen. Right now, Nord Stream 1 is still providing like 40% of the gas needs of the industrial engine of Germany through Ukraine, I believe, and it will continue to. And other than that, I don't think that any of the sanctions will work, because this is not a reasonable decision. It's an emotional decision. It's very much a kind of like pride, the pride of the leader, of the patriarch, who has been disrespected. It feels like a mafia family fight. Like the Don wants his ring to be kissed, basically. He's what used to be like his dependent is showing signs of disobedience, and that is just sets a bad example for all the other nations in the Russian sphere of influence. So it has to be dealt with in mafia family ways. Only they have nuclear weapons. I feel that this has shown kind of like the failure of the European Union, and to a lesser extent NATO, to prevent war, which was their promise, especially the European Union's. We also should say that there is a strong anti-war movement in Russia. That this is not about the Russian people, but their leadership. And this may also be about the Ukrainian leadership, and their failure to withdraw from NATO temporarily and put this issue to rest for the moment, until a change in the conditions would happen, which would happen within a few years. So a lot of male pride. And, it's ironic. I had told you that I wanted to do the episode about war and sex in the patriarchy, and how war kind of reenacts sex in the patriarchy, and how war reenacts sex, and how the patriarchy conflates sex with war since basically its inception, which began with the conflation of like procreative power with procreative domination, right? So man's instinct for domination has become one and the same with like man's instinct to mate for the past 6,000-7,000 years of this particular civilization that we have had, and the history of patriarchy kind of like continues in the same cliche way, in the same sad and disappointing way, rather than an enlightened way. And it is a dark and bleak day for Europe, for sure, to have like the beast of war unleashed again, potentially, on our soil. Yeah. Well, I mean, thank you. Like the first step is awareness and letting voices like yours, be heard. The next step, hopefully, is resistance, and consciousness, like just being conscious in how we understand what's going on, rather than remaining unconscious. And then, I just have hope. I do. Anyway, Chris, yes, this was an amazing conversation, which as I knew it would be. And I thank you for coming and for knowing so much about this, and, for the clarity of your vision and of your goodness, your moral goodness. I appreciate it deeply.
Yeah,
so, and everyone out there, thank you for listening. Thank you for being with us. And until next week, keep speaking war and sex. If I could make love incessantly, I would be God.